Welcome to your Week 3 online for your Addictions Counseling course. Today we're going to talk a little bit about history of drugs and substance use and laws around that. We're going to go through a historical timeline leading up to regulation, and then again back in time and then to today's view. And we're going to finish off with the introduction of the topic of models of dependence, but we will talk more in class this and next week about models of dependence. So for your connection activity, if you have not already, please pause this video and make sure that you go to your DC Connect and click on these two URL links. Those two will help in the discussion that I'm about to go through with these PowerPoint slides. For those two video links, you will require your library login, which all students have as long as you're paid attending student to Durham College. So you would have your username and password. Your username should be your student ID number, and then your password should be the same as what you would use to log in to the computers on campus. And if that password for some reason doesn't work, try your DC Connect password, which might be different. And if that doesn't work, then you'll have to contact IT to make sure you have your library login. Hopefully all of you have access to library materials being in your 4th semester. Okay, so you'll want to watch those two links first and then come back to this video. All right, so a little bit about history. Just take a moment to take a look at this advertisement of Coca-Cola and kind of what's happening, and maybe you can read the fine print, and just in case you can't, I have highlighted it for you. So here it says, drink Coca-Cola, the satisfying beverage, relieves the fatigue that comes from overplay, overwork, and overthinking. Delicious, refreshing, thirst quenching. That's a tongue tire. Now that piece where it says relieves fatigue, you might want to think about how Coca-Cola does that. Sure, yeah, there's a lot of sugar in it, but did you know that back in the day, it actually contained cocaine, hence the name Coca-Cola? Yep, it's not a myth. Another example of an advertisement. So here are two young little children. They look kind of like Jack and Jill, and there it says cocaine toothache drops. Yes, there were actual toothache drops that contained the ingredient cocaine, which sensibly would work to relieve a toothache. Now, sensibly to provide to children or even adults? I'm not sure I agree with that. Here's another advertisement. Bayer aspirin, which contained heroin, hydrochloride. And how about this one? Sweet, refreshing Valium. And you can see the woman, the back image of kind of dark and sad, the denial as the best alternative. And there she is, happy and smiling in her state of denial. Yep, these are actual advertisements. And then drinking leads to neglect of duty, moral degradation, and crime. And lastly, lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours. So that one represents prohibition, which we're going to talk about. Interesting how that pendulum swings. Okay, so here's our timeline. Here we go. In 1906, the first historical kind of date that I'd like you guys to be familiar with, 1906, is the Pure Food and Drug Act. And what this was, if you watched the video clips that I encouraged you to watch on DC Connect, it talks all about the Pure Food and Drug Act as foods and drugs that started to require labels. However, it did not regulate what was sold over the counter. So again, in that video, you might remember the woman talking about this mother who wrote an endorsement to a cough syrup company about how incredibly soothing the cough syrup was for her daughter when she was coughing and not well, and how cranky she was without that cough syrup. Well, it's probably because the cough syrup contained some sort of current day illicit drug like heroin. And then when the daughter was no longer taking that cough medicine, she was probably experiencing some withdrawal, which would make her cranky. Hence why the mother wrote this endorsement of how incredible the cough syrup was. Of course it was working, but nobody seemed to question it. So then finally in 1906, this Pure Food and Drug Act started to require that companies put ingredients on the label of the items that they were selling over the counter, but it didn't actually restrict the ingredients. So you could include all the cocaine, all the heroin that you wanted, you just had to make sure you listed it on the product. So that didn't seem to really kind of conquer the issues that were happening. So in 1914, the Harrison Act was introduced. And this is in the States, but Canada pretty much followed suit. So the Harrison Act now took it a step further, and not only did companies have to include labels, but they also were restricted from the quantities and amounts of these substances that they could actually include in the product. So in this regard, blame was placed on the minorities because that seemed easier. So Chinese immigrants who held opium dens were kind of blamed, and then that's where they came with this act of restricting what ingredients could be included. And the outcome is that the government implemented a taxation. Interesting. So a taxation of opium and coca products specifically. Then we continue to swing that pendulum even further. Excuse me. And we have prohibition, which lasted from 1907 to the 1930s. That is a long time. For those of you who have not seen the series Boardwalk Empire, I highly recommend watching a few episodes because it really depicts prohibition and the impact it had in terms of the black market and people who would still find ways to consume alcohol, but they would just do it in sort of an illegal way. So alcohol through prohibition was viewed by women specifically as the root of all evil, and they feared that the consumption of alcohol would lead to the destruction of family. Again, you really got to check out Boardwalk Empire. It's a fun, enjoyable show, and yet it really covers prohibition quite well. Then in 1919, the court ruled that addiction was not actually a disease and therefore could not be treated with medication. So at this point, people started to be labeled as criminals and were punished for consuming substances. So the issue with this is that they implemented it as a rule, as a law, and as punishment, but they didn't really have any effective treatment at this point. So you can imagine lots of people were incarcerated for substance use when really incarceration is probably not the most effective method for somebody who has an addictions issue. Talk about that in a minute. Then in 1970s, we have the war on drugs when Nixon came into power and his big philosophy was the war on drugs. When you think about war on drugs, I encourage you to think simply about that wording. What exactly are we fighting against when we say war on drugs? And then how about today? I mean, talk about that pendulum swinging back and forth. Boy, am I getting dizzy, because we know that today there's a completely different view about substance use, and we're looking at legalization of marijuana, which we'll talk about some of the pros and possible cons of. So just going back in time again briefly, historically views and attitudes towards alcohol and drug misuse and abuse have largely been based on prejudices and misunderstandings. So again, when we talk about historically, minorities were blamed at one point, and then everybody was blamed for just being immoral for using drugs, and they put in this big law that you would go to prison if you were using these illicit drugs. So again, lots of prejudices, lots of misunderstandings, not really tackling the root of the issue or working towards treatment. In the early 1900s, it was this disease model in that once a person was addicted, it was irreversible. So it wasn't on any kind of continuum. It was like, once you get addicted, you're screwed. That's it. It's irreversible. Like a medical illness, there was no way of curing it except for introducing medication, which is similar to how you would treat disease, hence the disease model. Then in 1919, again, when those courts ruled that addiction was not a disease because they smartened up and realized that using medication to treat an addictions issue wasn't really the solution, then they started to look at it from a different perspective. So here they were labeled as criminals and punishment, and jail ensued, and that is kind of in line with what we would call the moral model. So consequence of personal choice, i.e. the alcoholic was lacking in morals and was weak in character, therefore was punished, such as going to prison. So you can probably start to see that neither of these models, the disease model nor the moral model, were entirely effective. Let's see if we're doing any better nowadays. Before we move on, a pause for critical thinking. If we imprisoned a person for illicit drug use, it would be an example of negative punishment. Is punishment an effective treatment for substance use? Why or why not? Should drugs be used to treat drug use? Why or why not? In addition to that, can you think of any examples of drugs being used to treat drug use? And then lastly, is substance abuse a heritable trait? In other words, can we inherit the predisposition to be addicted? And if so, how can we prevent or treat if it's an inherited trait? Food for thought. So thinking back to how history relates to current day, various theories and models of alcohol and drug use have stemmed out of that historical perspective that we just went through. And the reason why it's important for us now, today, in this existing class and moving forward into the field of social service work is because knowing theories and how we view addiction, how our client views addiction, how society views addiction will help us to understand why the client began using, why the client is struggling to stop using, and why the client relapses. From bloodletting to pills, in class this week, we're going to talk about all those models of dependence. I've included another link just about today's view, so you can click on that on your own time. But here's a quote that I took from that exact webpage, and that is, "We will legalize, regulate, and restrict access to marijuana." So maybe in class we can have a little bit of a debate or discussion about how that'll look and what that'll mean. I'll just get us started. Some of the pros I can think of are that it fits in line with harm reduction and it gives power of personal choice. Some of the cons that I imagine you and peers might think of are a fear about easy access and what that'll mean, and the power of personal choice and what that'll mean. So power of personal choice on both sides. I'm just going to leave you with this last little image because in class we will talk about the theories and models of addiction in much greater detail. But I want you to think of these various terms: disease, media impact, the quote of "it's all in your head." So thinking about psychological, thinking about nature, thinking about nurture, social influence, and family. And again, we will break each of those down in class and talk about the models of addiction. Hopefully this was helpful. See you in class.